Hello, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Tony Vlahos for ExecuNet, and the gentleman seated virtually right across from me or next to me, depending on your perspective, is Joel Koplentz of the Koblentz Group, which is a firm widely recognized for successfully recruiting senior leaders from public companies, investor-controlled enterprises, and family businesses globally. Joel is also an ExecuNetSelect recruiting partner who, among many other expert voices here at ExecuNet, generously shares his time and insights with senior level people to help them explore options, make confident choices, and take their next great step forward. Well, the times we're living in continue to challenge leaders to think differently while considering opportunities to evaluate their career goals and priorities. You're probably one of those leaders, which is why you tuned in today. And quite possibly you're pondering options for the next great chapter in your career. What lies ahead? How do you navigate the rolling tide? Well, these questions and more are the subject of our conversation today. Joel, as always, such a pleasure to see you and to talk to you.
My pleasure, Tony. My pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. Let's just dive right into it. So, Joel, we know the times we're living in. So how have the global changes of the last, dare I say, couple of years going on 3, changed the way that institutions recruit senior leadership? What have you been noticing?
Well, I tell you, I'm going to go back to something that we did a few years ago, and that was we would have a group of CEOs meet about once or twice a month, and they were different. We have a very small group, 5 or 6, and we would mix it up. And one of the questions, and even though they may have known each other or not know each other, they may be, but they weren't competitive with each other. And they were from companies that were owned in various ways, public companies, private equity companies, leading a family business, or maybe running a family office. And the CEOs, the question we would ask, irrespective of their sector, their scale, any of the issues that would be specific to that is, how far into the future can you really look and be comfortable about making the decisions that you want to make? And the question at that point always elicited an answer that was about 2 years. You know, I think we can look out 2 years, and I think I can, if I want to align my strategy, my structure, my organization, and drive my team towards those priorities, I could feel comfortable in making those investments, whether they be capital or human or technological, or building new platforms altogether innovative. I could look out 2 years, and I can also look at my competitive set and get a perspective on distance and time. Today, when we have those same discussions, and now we're doing them virtually, just like we're doing this, and sometimes they're just one-on-one, so we don't have the group. But I keep asking the same question, and the question now becomes much more granular. Well, I can't focus much on the future. I've got to deal with what's in front of me right now. Okay. And then I pressed the question again. I said, well, if you had to, what would you see? He said, most of them say, I'm looking through foggy windows, our words, not theirs. And therefore, I'm looking at the competitive set, and I'm looking at the opportunity, but I'm looking at the challenges I got to face now. And most of them then will suggest no more than 6 months, okay? Because this COVID hit them, this pandemic hit them right between the eyes. Nobody planned for it, no one. No one thought about it. It wasn't a contingent plan. It wasn't a risk in their thinking. Who would have ever, as they'd say in the old days, thunk it, right? So now they're faced with this whole other issue of how to realign themselves between setting priorities, the strategy, the structure, the organization, and drive through to those priorities. The pressure from the top, from the ownership, whether it's a board, whether it's private equity partners, or whether it's a family enterprise and the family, you know, owns the business with maybe partners or non-partners, and they have a non-family member or maybe even a family member running it. The pressure to deliver value has never been greater. So here's the outcome of all that. It's a long-winded answer to take you around the bush here, but the answer is, while this is a great time to look at a future, the opportunities have never been greater, okay? Because when all the pieces on the board are moving, if you can somehow make sense of the pieces, you're going to be one of the few that does and can take advantage of that And what that does is enhance valuation. Okay. On the other hand, you still got to deal with the daily grind, bringing people back to work, dealing with COVID and inflation, supply chain issues, and so forth. And so these leaders feel, if you can imagine an Oreo, they feel like they're the center of the Oreo. They're getting pressure from the bottom and the culture that it takes to drive value. Not invented here. You and I have talked about this before. Not invented here. Why should I do it? We've never done it before. I'm not going to leave my swim lane. Okay. And so they get the pushback from the culture, but they still have to drive value. And what the leaders don't want to be, they don't want to be the leader on the white horse with the saber going forward and looking back and nobody's follow up. On the other hand, they're getting pressure from the top. And the pressure from the top from the owners is whether it's, again, any type of company, the pressure comes from the shareholders. It comes from balancing stakeholder rights with shareholder rights. It comes from activist shareholders if it's a public company. It comes from quarterly guidance and delivering a value. One wants to see what happens if you don't deliver value. Look at a couple of companies. Look at Goldman Sachs that reported earnings the other day below guidance. Look at what happened to the stock. When the Dow went down, what, almost 500 points? 200 and some points of that was associated with Goldman's drop. So, you know, you're almost in the middle of trying to manage up and down at the same time. And that's creating this kind of angst, anxiety, and not really clear strategy going forward. However, the risk is greater if you sit and do nothing and wait for the foggy windows to clear. So what they're looking for in management and leaders are people who can take this kind of anxiety and work their way through it and understand they're going to hit a number of decision points. It isn't just going to go, I start here and I end here. There's going to be, because of the change in the atmosphere in which they're working, the competition, the cost of capital, all the challenges related to global supply chain, human capital, price of goods and services, the technology underscoring all of this, and the disruptions that all of this creates, that you're going to have to work, a leader is going to have to work his way through each and every step and not be right all the time. Be comfortable that you're going to be wrong. If you think you're the smartest person in the room, find another room, okay? There are no answers right now. There's just a series of questions.
So I can, of course, fully appreciate, especially around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Oreo cookie metaphor. All you've done is help my stomach rumble there. But anyway.
We should pass them out to all.
Help me understand and help all of us kind of put together. You identified there are certain traits that a leader will need to navigate the top and the bottom part of the sandwich. Help us understand what those skill sets really look like. What do you need to be great at in a leadership role in 2022?
I think there's no doubt that listening and communication are near the top of the list. But the key, as it's always been, is building trust among your management team. Oftentimes, and too often today, by the time information gets through an organization and is presented to the CEO who makes the decision, he or she is under pressure from the top part of the Oreo, if you will, to make that decision and make the right decision, or at least a rational decision. It may not turn out to be right, but a rational decision based on information that he or she must have. The critical question that they should be asking, the CEOs should be asking, and we seek this with people who can unvarnish what I'm about to tell you. What's the question I need to ask that you're not telling me about? Okay, what do I need to know that you're not telling me? So communication and the ability to cogently identify information, figure out what's important and what's a priority and what isn't, putting aside all the morass of information that might be available. And because we're in a time of great change, the smart move for CEOs is to surround themselves with people who are disciplined in their thinking, but bring perspective and insight. And they're willing to look at ideas that aren't the norm or the de rigueur of their organization.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to be able to understand how to play that in the organization. It's one thing to have ideas. It's another thing to say, well, how do we implement this and truly execute it? Because the truth is the real dollars fall from execution. They don't fall from ideas, okay? And most companies just aren't an idea, okay? They're composed of a number of different elements. So one has to look at the ideas and understand how we can execute it. And that's the ability to make an organization believe. Make an organization believe. And that's all about trust, especially now because leaders have to be trusted. Organizations won't follow, or leaders won't stay. You know, the leaders who report to the very top, they won't stay if they don't believe that they're being listened to. They're building teams that will trust them, let alone their trust in their lead.
Mhm.
So it is about trust, it is about discipline, and you have to have courage. Okay. Is it less about experience? To some extent, yes. Okay. Why? Okay. Experience, certainly when we do our work at CEO level and board level, they look at experience. Almost, I mean, that's the given, that's the table stakes. And I can tell you in almost any role that we might search for, we could find a number of people who will check the competence box the client is seeking. The difference is fit. What are the 2 or 3 priorities that that client has that have to be addressed over the next year? And how will this candidate, if selected, attack those, address them, attack them, so solve it? Through its complexity, through the unknowns, through the briar patches and what have you, so that it's going to take discipline and courage, and sometimes just saying, didn't get it done. Now we got to change direction here. And that's what our clients are looking for. Okay, they're not looking for plug and play. You know, okay, we want a CFO who's done this, 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 and this. That's the table stakes. Okay, that's the got to have those. But what they're really looking for is top teams that really function together and trust one another and bring different perspectives and insights. Because what's happening today isn't going to happen tomorrow. Best example of that is AI. Okay, AI. AI is going to impact every company. Okay, so if you're a unionized company today and you've got employees, what's going to happen when AI, when what the car companies started to do 20 years or 25 years ago, putting in robots and what have you, and having to renegotiate with the negotiators? What's going to happen when AI begins to do some of these tasks? There's work being done today, for example, that AI is even seeping into professional services. Some law firms are beginning to use AI to examine simple contracts. Orthopedic surgeons are beginning to use it because the AI can actually diagnose conditions probably faster and more effectively than the doctor's eye. Now, there's all kinds of societal questions around it. Who owns the data and is really HIPAA controlled? And, you know, you get into all of that. But the point is, it's changing the way people work. Okay, and it's going to change the way leaders will have to lead. And that dislocation is going to suggest that people looking to the next step in their career have got to start thinking that it isn't linear any longer. I do this, so I'm prepared to do that, and therefore I could do this. And what it means, if you boil this all down, all the research shows that 70% of individuals making more than $100,000 a year are unhappy, uncomfortable, angry, frustrated, and so forth. And part of that frustration is this monumental change, which we knew was happening, but it was accelerated under COVID and continues to accelerate today. And so if you want to remain in that 70%, keep thinking linearly. Okay, the way out of it is to begin to develop those kinds of skills that help you lead in an uncertain and a world that's made up of employees. The sphere is the same, but the anxiety and then the know-how of put these pieces together, put Humpty Dumpty back together again, is really very much in vogue with the kind of clients that we serve. Now, it's hard to describe in any firm, any search. It's certainly not on the job description. But I can tell you the clients, when the job description is done, they put it away. They go to that scorecard and they look at those 3 things that we have to accomplish. And then they look at, well, that's what, then how? Okay, we've rationalized why, and we know what and why, but we don't know how. So that's what this individual has to bring.
So we're leaning into the part of the talk that I'm sure most of our audience is really keen to hear, which is, yes, the world of leadership has shape-shifted, and now we understand from your point of view, what kind of leaders it will require for organizations to continue to grow and move forward. As we think about executives in their individual careers who want to change direction, either stay in corporate life and do something different, or actually leave it or complement it with some other career choice. Let's begin there with just what's the state of recruiting these days, Joel? We've heard that job creation is up. There's a lot of activity, probably fewer people landing than they probably thought they would be by now, but there's certainly a lot of form of hiring going on. What's your perspective on that? What's actually going on at that level?
Well, if we're talking at the CEO and direct report to CEO level, those are very carefully and should be very carefully crafted hires. Okay. And what's on the job description and what a lot of search firms do, honestly, is they plug and play. Okay. They look and they say, okay, this person has this, 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 and this. And they put them in front of the client, and the client suggests that they're a fit or not a fit. Okay. When I'm done with this, I'm going to give you an example of one to show you what's working and what isn't. Unfortunately, as these companies evolve, they cannot put on paper exactly what they're looking for, which slows the hiring process up. In fact, if you look at most job descriptions, Tony, I'd tell you they're 3-hump camels.
Do they know what they're looking for? Let's start there.
Sometimes they don't, and then sometimes there's a confusion. I'd say more times than not, they don't, and there's a confusion. That's the majority of them. Why? Because job descriptions are made up of two things. They start with what the job description was before when they filled it. Okay, CFO role. Let's see what we wrote about. Let's see our job description from 3 years ago. Okay, they pull it out of the files, and 3 or 4 people mark it up. So then you end up with a 3-hump camel. Okay, and that's why in our particular firm we use scorecards. We go to priorities and the who, what, and why. Okay. In any case, oftentimes when they see candidates, they're seeing a lot of candidates because they can't ferret out exactly what they're looking for, and they don't understand. They know the world's changing, and they want somebody on the team that can deal with the problems they have today because they don't know what's coming. And so they don't spend as much time looking at the leap, the intellectual leap, the experiential leap, the competence leap, just the overall business acumen leap that it's going to take to be a player going forward. And let's face it, you go into a Barnes and Noble or any bookstore today and you want to read a book on leaders, you can go down the aisle and you can find probably 2,000 biographies, if they stacked them, if they really stocked them and they were stacked up and you could see. None of the people who were written about were ordinary. They just didn't do the ordinary. So leaders today have to think how to magnetize what they have and not be the ordinary going forward. But here's the problem. And I promised you a little vignette. Here it is. It's an individual who built a stand-up company that was two big companies formed a partnership. And that company ended up in 2 years to be almost a $5 billion company. CEO decides, that because the two competitors had built this business, it was too difficult and they moved too slow to really take it to the next level. So he sought another role. And he takes over as president of that was a private company. He takes over as CEO of a public company. He's called me 3 times in the last month to talk about how miserable he is because the decision-making is so slow. He said glaciers move faster than us. Okay. And he's not accustomed to that. So oftentimes the culture and the way decisions are made often determine the fit. Okay. What works for one doesn't necessarily work for another, in spite of the pressure to keep moving faster and keep moving. Remember the vignette of the white horse and keep looking back and make sure that you're not moving so fast and the culture isn't supporting you that no one's behind you. So that it's this combination of culture and teams to build leadership on one hand, and perception and speed to meet perception and adjusting as long as you go. So what you have in the middle of that kind of those curves crossing is this high anxiety of trying to be right and trying to lead. And that in itself has its own kinds of tensions, if you will.
Let's go back to the perspective of that individual executive who wants to land a new role, for example. What you've set up here is a really curious dilemma, right? Which is an organization may not know who they're looking for. And if they do, they're, I'll say, inept at describing who they're looking for through a job description. And you've got an executive who desperately wants to be seen for what difference they can make.
Right.
What can the executive, who, let's face it, wants to have as much control over their destiny as humanly possible, do in that situation to drive the change they want forward? What do you recommend as a recruiter that someone do to be seen for who they really are?
Well, I think obviously the first step is passing the competency, which is what the search firm will likely do, okay, or however they recruit you. Second is when you're in front of the client, don't be afraid to ask the tough questions. Be prepared, know their business, even if you don't come from their sector. Do your homework and be prepared to ask the right questions. Do not fear that if I ask this question, they may not think of me as, you know, as warmly as I'd like them to think about me. Okay. That's the second point. And then the third piece is ask about how they make decisions. What's important to them about how they make decisions? Okay. Too often when individuals take these roles, they find out that some of the decisions that they thought would be made in the way that maybe their prior companies made them aren't the way this company makes it. Assume every company is unique. Start with a white sheet of paper. Okay. Learn about that company and do not fear. Have the courage to ask tough questions. And the questions you can ask is say, look, I've looked at your operating division and you keep stressing operating leverage and you know, an efficiency of operations. Yet that's been the theme over the last 4 or 5 investor calls. Where are you on that? And why? What have you achieved and what's held you back? Okay. And then you can say, well, if you haven't achieved it, let's talk about those matters that have held you back. Is it culture? Is it lack of concentration? Is it a change in business focus? Is it we didn't have the capital that we underestimated the capital it was going to take to make the adjustment? Also understand that when companies start talking about transformations, over 70% of the transformations do not succeed. And it's because they outline, we want to go from here to here, and they don't make the adjustments in between, which gives a candidate the opportunity to say, I know your business is transforming, every business is. Tell me about how you're transforming this business and what roadblocks you've hit and why and how you've dealt with them. The how they've dealt with them gives you a very good sense of the role and what needs to be done and whether you're going to have the support to do it, whether you're going to have the people, the organization structure, the capital, whatever, or the technology to support you in that change.
So the places where an executive can be noticed for having done these things clearly is the interview, which is, if it's a linear process, it'd be further down the line. The resume, possibly your LinkedIn profile. The question I'm going to ask you is, where are recruiters looking these days for the talent that is needed and the fit that is required for the organization to succeed? Is it the usual places like LinkedIn? Are there unusual places in 2022 where an executive should invest more time and creativity to be noticed? What's your sense of that, Joel?
Well, you know, LinkedIn is a wonderful tool, but a lot of top leaders are not on it. Okay. I wasn't sure we should be on it. I mean, yeah, we put our own page up and I don't know, maybe we have 200 followers, maybe. I mean, it's just not valuable to us per se. Sometimes where we use it is if someone mentions somebody to us and we want to get a quick fix of who they are. So you can look up a profile. But we don't use that necessarily in our search process. We go to trusted sources, people who would know the subject, people we know that are change masters, who understand culture and deliver value. Okay? That's what we look for. And usually because of that, a lot of that comes from years of doing this and reputation and access. Okay. It's all done confidentially, so they know that whatever they tell us isn't going to be little bird on the pole speaking to everybody else. And that's helped us get to the right candidates. I'll tell you what I think individuals can do to kind of move their process along. Two things. We've seen the way resumes have been presented and changed. They are very, very difficult to follow. And I have to say, we don't spend much time on resumes. So, you look at them, you get a summary of the individual, and you understand kind of their progression, what they've learned, where they've learned it, and what they're really kind of prepared for or interested in. Okay, that's it. That happens in a minute to a minute and a half, to be honest.
Wow, I was prepared to hear seconds. If you're spending a minute, I think you're an exception.
Well, sometimes you got to go back through it a few times. And the reason you have to go back through it is because the way people are laying out these resumes in colors, blue and white and blocks, I can't follow it. I'm just a simple guy trying to do a job. Okay. So I would say make the resume clear. Okay. Also, in preparing for this, people think about relationships and they call it networking. It isn't. It's, I'd say, the smartest move right now for folks, because of the way the atmosphere is moving, the changes that's afoot, and it's only going to accelerate, is to lay out your most influential people around your career. Okay, maybe you've met them in working at not-for-profits, on their boards, maybe you've met them in church, the synagogue, the mosque, wherever you've met them. Okay, and begin to cultivate their ideas. Say, tell me how. It's not a question of asking for their advice. It's a question of what their journey was about, and that opens the door to ask for advice and ask for relationships, or networking, or whatever one wants to call it. That's much more effective. We know today that over 3/4 of the roles are filled, even at the very top, by people they know or know of. It's the same inside a boardroom. Is not filled by answering a LinkedIn ad or whatever, unless you're at a level where that's more common. At the levels that we work, it's uncommon. So I think if you do that and you continually cultivate those people who are in your most influential, and you find out who may not be in your influential by talking with them, then you begin to substitute people in and out. And that's the people that you want to have almost as your career board of directors, more or less, where you can seek their advice, understand and of course you're giving something back to them, because they're going to call you. It's not a one-way street. I can't tell you how many people, I wish I had a tally, but I don't. How many people said, yeah, I sought a lot of people's help and I took this last role and, I'm ready to move on. And I'll ask them, have you kept up with those people? And well, I was too busy. Why do you expect them now, when you call them, to say, yeah, come right over, let's have a chat? They're not going to do it. Okay? They're not going to do it unless they think there's something in it for them, because they've been taken advantage of. So don't take advantage of anybody. Use it as an opportunity, because everyone in your network, everyone is in the same situation. They're in play all the time. We have no problem in picking up the phone and talking to people who are well ensconced in their jobs and maybe even be happy. They're willing to listen and maybe intrigued by something else. But you got to be in that network. You got to play in that game. And if you think you can go get a job and I'll be happy there forever, no.
Let's pick up on that, as we've all had what I like to call a moment, an existential moment. No one's been exempt from this, right? And executives are also people, of course. So we've been looking at our lives, our work lives, and wondering whether where we are is where we either want to be or should be or need to be. And at times been looking far more expansively at our options than we ever have before. I'm one of them, certainly. And I'm wondering what your experience has been like so far, Joel, working with organizations as well as executives, both inside them and wanting to get inside them. For example, have you noticed that executives are far more open to possibilities of relocation or different industries, or kind of looking more broadly at everything and wondering where they might make the greatest difference? What's been your experience so far?
I think as people, because we're talking about humans and people, As individuals get, uh, let's say, into the middle of their career, what we've begun to see more and more of, it was unusual before, but not so unusual now. It's not quite common yet. It's individuals taking stock of their lives and asking themselves, I've climbed the ladder. I've given up quite a lot to do that. Is this what I want to do with the rest of my life? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. For those that haven't, there's an individual who's a former very senior and well-known investment banker. He and his wife have opened he quit Wall Street, very top of his profession. You'd know the name if I mentioned it. And he's currently running a bed and breakfast in the Northeast. There's an individual who I know now is a plumber. I didn't know his background. He has an advanced degree from Wharton. He worked at private equity, something he didn't want to do anymore. Did a succession project for a CEO role a few years ago where we started with 10 candidates, all internal, came down to 3. One of the 3 called me on a weekend. It's a 2-year process. And he said to me, I don't want to be in the process any longer. He was probably one of the final 2. He was very much at the top of his career. Had almost been astronomical in his career in terms of steps. And I said to him, well, Jim, what is it? What's driving you to this? And as you know, you get to know these candidates if you go through our kind of process for a couple of years. And I had no sense of this, even as well as I knew him. He said, I have a teaching certificate. I always wanted to be a teacher. This isn't really what I want to do. Okay, he's now teaching school. Okay? So you're seeing people make these adjustments. As I said, it's not quite common, but you see it more than you used to. For people who want to stay in the corporate world but want something altogether different, maybe it's moving from a major corporation to a mid-cap, or they want to be an entrepreneur or whatever. You begin to understand what that means. If you're one of those, you have to understand what it means and what its implications are. Okay, and that's where you use that network I was talking about. And you ask them questions. Say, have you met people who've done something like this before? You may or may not do it, but I'm just trying to gather some information and some insights, so that you begin to build a knowledge base of what fits for you at this point in life. We've seen over the last few, I'd say months, probably a year to year and a half at most, the impact of working at home. Okay. Sometimes it's difficult. We're talking about relocation. Well, it's dislocation in many respects. People are working at home and they don't want to go back to the office. Many don't. Why? Because what's the commute? An hour each way? Well, that's 2 hours of productivity, or 2 hours every day I'm taking away from my family. That's one day. That's basically 1 day a week, one work day a week, sitting in an automobile, maybe talking on a Bluetooth, but sitting in an automobile. People are finding that as these mechanisms, the videos become more effective, that they can do their work or lead teams or whatever. Now, it's not as effective as you and I, Tony, is sitting in a room or with all of your guests. You don't see the whites of people's eyes, so to speak. But in the end of the day, we're all going through these kinds of adjustments. And it isn't uncommon for people to think about making these adjustments in life that really fits them. And one more story I can tell you. This is a guy who was in succession to be one of 3 possible CEO candidates for it's a New York Stock Exchange company. Internal candidates. He's running their largest division. He's an individual in his mid-40s. On his way, he was the youngest of them and probably had the longest runway. He called me and he said, I've decided to leave. He said, I'm losing my family. My kids are growing up. I'm never home. It's nothing that I really signed up for. It's just that everything seemed to kind of move up. And, I have my career aspirations. The sad story about this is that he did leave. And obviously he had some resources. So he bought a couple of silk printing franchises. So his kids could work there after school. Okay. Called me about a year later I'd seen him in between. His name was Tim, and he said, "I need you to take me off of your CEO list where we send out some things. You've seen some of the things we write, Tony." And I said, "Well, did I offend you?" He said, "No." He said, "Unfortunately, you don't know." I said, "No." He said, "Unfortunately, I have a pancreatic cancer." And he said, "What I'm trying to do now," he's 47 years old. He said, "Well, I'm just trying to stay alive until my youngest one graduates high school next June." And he didn't make it. Okay. The point is, if you're going to make a change in life, don't just talk about it. Do your research, talk to people, think about it, and try and figure out where you are at your point in life, what really matters to you before you make that change, so that you make the right change, whether
That's
it's corporate America or elsewhere.
Mhm.
I can also tell you, at Emory University, where I've been associated for some time, they have an executive MBA program. And I was talking to the head of that a couple of years ago. He told, and those are the people that come in on a weekend every second or third weekend. So they're not there every day. They have jobs. And he was telling me 2/3 to 75% of the students in that current class, this is 2 years ago, before COVID, were physicians. Okay. Looking basically not to practice medicine or to get a business background so that they could maybe go in a different direction. So this is what you're talking about is not uncommon. Okay? It's not uncommon. What becomes the glue is individuals sitting in a chair saying, I should have thought about it. Maybe I should have. Maybe I could have. Maybe I should have talked to this person. Why would they talk to me? Have courage and have those conversations.
That's terrific advice. I want to leap from there to one of the options, Joel, that executives have long found attractive, which is building a portfolio of board seats. I know that that's an area of focus of your firm, and we could probably spend another hour talking about how to network your way onto a board or multiple boards. Could you give us the Cliff Note version, something that would just help the audience think through the possibility, because I know it's one that has long been on executives' minds.
Preparing for a board seat is important. Preparation comes into two kinds of maybe three buckets. One is you got to have a resume people can read, just as I was talking about before. And with that, you have to have what I call a board bio. It's basically a description of maybe three themes that run through whomever you've worked with throughout your career. Okay. The second thing to prepare is you have to get board education. Where do you get board education? Well, there's various universities that provide it. I led the one at Emory for a number of years. We don't do it any longer with the change of deans, but Wharton has one. I think it's NYU has one. Northwestern, UCLA, so forth. Duke had one, and Duke suspended about the same time we did at Emory. So there's nothing in the South to speak of. The gold standard, however, is Stanford. It's the most expensive. Okay, and what's important there? It's what's to learn. You want to learn what people are really doing and what's really happening inside a boardroom. So it's not a fantasy or an expectation or whatever. It's real. It's real. It's granular. It's the kinds of issues that they are struggling with, and the kinds of issues that they're expected to govern and opine. And second, with that, you meet people who are in the same boat. Why is that important? Well, because 80% of board seats, and this is all researched, 80% of board seats go to people. It's like a club. They go to people that either the board knows or knows of. The other 20% goes to folks like myself, or if they want something independent, they go to folks like myself. The other thing one can do in that context to be known is there are a number of organizations which exist basically for board education. So instead of going to the seminar out at Stanford or UCLA or Northwestern, whatever, you could join the National Association of Corporate Directors. And perhaps if you're on a board, I think they have some criteria that they used to not have. But if you pass the criteria, it's an organization worth considering. In Georgia, we have a group called On Board. It's to assist women getting on corporate boards. There's another group called the American Association of Corporate Directors that also provides various levels of certification and education. And you're in the group with others who are doing the same, which of course builds out your cadre of contacts. And so that's the Cliff Notes version of how I would start.
Terrific. What else would you like executives who are thinking about any kind of change in 2022, whether it's leaning into a different role in a different organization or pursuing options, be they board seats or you mentioned franchise ownership, what would you most want them to remember and implement as they begin this quest for something new for themselves in 2022?
Tell you what we've suggested, and it comes from a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist. And I was talking to him about this 70-30. Okay, 70% of people are, as I described them, unhappy, uncomfortable, frustrated, angry, whatever. And I said, does the research show that? And he said, yeah, it really does. And he said, that's my patient base. I said, well, how do you move people from 70 to 30? He said, well, that's the role. He said, sometimes I'm successful and sometimes I'm not. You're dealing with humans. So we decided that one way for individuals to really get hold of themselves, to understand who they are. Look, it's a fair assumption that all of us look in the mirror and lie to ourselves every day. Okay, that's a fair assumption, isn't it? I still think I'm 29 until I look in the mirror.
Okay? Wait, breaking news, you're not? Wait a second.
Yeah,
I read it differently.
but you lie to yourself. Okay, so the way to get at this, we figured out. We thought about, is there a way to make this an app, or neither of us are capable of doing that, so we stopped. Just take a white sheet of paper, go into a room, close the door, take a white sheet of paper and write everything down that you like doing on your left and everything you don't like doing on your right, preferences. Okay, and don't make it, if I like the Yankees, I hate the Red Sox. It's not if this then that. Okay? It can be personal, professional, it could be community, it could be religious, it could be whatever. And do it, spend about 45 minutes without interruptions, closed door. Here's the key. Don't show it to anybody. Don't talk about it with anybody. Don't talk about what you wrote down. Don't show it to anybody for their comment. Is this really me? No, don't do any of that. Put it away for 2 weeks. Try not to think about it. And you'll pick it up again. What you'll notice is you'll begin to refine things on either side of the center line. You may add things, you may subtract things. But again, key is don't show it to anybody. Don't talk to anybody about it. Try not to think about it. You will, but try not to. And then put it away again for 2 more weeks. And at the end of that period, so you've gone a month now, started 2 weeks and then final 2 weeks, look at it again and you'll make some final refinements. And that's who you are right now. Okay? What you're going to see as you go through life is you change. Your interests change, your priorities change, and how you think about life changes. Start again in 6 months. Don't even look back at the 3 steps you just did, but start with a fresh piece of paper and go through those 3 steps. At the end of 6 months, when you get to that 3rd step, look back at where your 3rd step was 6 months ago. And you're going to see you're evolving, maybe subtly. But those subtle changes certainly drive what's really important to you. Okay? And that helps you get it gives you a meter. When people say, well, Tony, you ought to do this, and Tony, you ought to do that. Well, now you know yourself well enough to say, interesting, and it's tempting, but it's not me.
Right. Well, that's a really interesting exercise. I am going to try that. I hope everyone else does as well. And I'm going to start to bring this to a close. We've had some great questions. I thank you all for whoever chatted them in for doing so. I know that Kim earlier chatted a bit of a commercial to all who haven't taken fully advantage of our amazing cadre of strategists and coaches here at ExecuNet who can help you with the very things that Joel and I have been talking about, namely explore possibilities, do some assessment of yourself and what's next for you, and figure out what that next step might be. That's what we are here for. So if you haven't taken that step with us, I encourage you to do so. And we'll help you figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So Joel, I want to just turn to you briefly as we wrap up this delightful talk for any final thoughts, anything I didn't cover that you really wanted our senior level audience to know today. Anything before we officially press pause?
Well, I'll share just a couple of things. I haven't really thought these through, obviously, because I didn't know what the questions were going to be. But I think being careful is important, but being bold is equally important. We're in a world of trying things. No one has, as I mentioned before, the keys to the castle of knowledge or insight of what this world will be. So one has to step back and ask yourself, how can I continually learn? How can I continually learn? One thing that I've watched in the most successful people in professional life, and I'm not talking about how much money they make, I'm talking the ones that can make the greatest impact. They bring to their roles insights from other points of view. It could be from science, it could be from math, it could be from the military or whatever. And I can tell you one story after another of that. This came to me when I was listening to a lecture by Charlie Munger, who is Warren Buffett's partner. And Charlie said, I spend an hour every day reading something I know nothing about. Okay. And that perspective, look at what they've done as investors. It certainly plays into that perspective. It certainly makes you a more interesting individual and makes you, it doesn't make you a fountain of knowledge, but it makes you a more interesting individual as the world begins to change. And if you're looking at a role, it makes you a more interesting candidate. So one thing that I do, and I think a lot of leaders do, is they try and have quiet time every day and read and think and hear lectures of whatever it might be to get perspective. Okay. So you don't go off the rails with, oh my God, this happened today. Okay, well, how many times has it happened in the past? How did people deal with it? What do we know about Roosevelt and their relationship with Churchill? Why does that matter today? Well, let me give you an example of what I mean. I was reading a book on Winston Churchill. I thought I knew a lot about him. I didn't realize that he wasn't Prime Minister of England until he was 65 years old. He was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister in 1940. Okay. And the first 9 months, 10 months when he was Prime Minister, it was about holding that country together while they were under attack, as all of Europe was completely Nazified, as you may know. How do you, when you're under siege, how do you communicate? How do you hold people together when you don't have the resources? How do you, and you can watch, you can say he was masterful, you can say he wasn't masterful, but you can watch how he did that and how that applies maybe to thinking about leadership now. You can look at how we're dealing with gene sequencing, and the same thing. There is a certain way of thinking about things that maybe we haven't thought about that applies in our real life. Maybe it won't help you with your kids. Okay, I understand, but it didn't help me with mine. But I will tell you, fortunately, they're good kids. But if you start being interested and curious about the world you're in, and you're learning something more and more about it, even as it moves in all these different directions on a series, it's like on an axis with a ball, but it's not going straight. It's spinning this way and spinning that way. The more you learn about connectivity, call it a business sociology, if you will. The more you know about yourself, putting those two things together makes you a much more interesting individual. And those people that are in that inner circle that I was describing to you will find you more interesting. And the more interesting you are, the more they're going to open up and be helpful to you. And the more interesting that they find you, the more they're going to ask you to be helpful to them. And that's where this game is really being played. It's not being played on LinkedIn.
Right, right. Terrific. What a wonderful story to end our conversation with. And my gosh, 65 and Prime Minister, I got to think about that option myself as I move in that direction as well.
I'll give you one more. David Libeskind, who is the architect that built the Freedom Tower, it's the architect of the Freedom Tower. In an interview, he talked about something, and I want to leave you with this. He's 75 years old. He's a Polish immigrant to the United States. He didn't become an architect till he's 44, and he's world renowned. Okay. In a conversation, he talked about how he made this change. He said, sometimes you just have to get older to be young again. Mm. And the reason is, philosophically speaking, the reason that he said that was, as you go through a career, you're giving up and you're doing things you really didn't want to do, but you have to do in order to pay your dues, right? And there's parts of every job that, you probably don't, even if you want the job and you're doing the job, there's things you don't like about it, or, you much prefer to spend your time over here, but you got to spend it over here. Who wants to deal with back to work issues, really, when should be dealing with strategic issues? Okay, so sometimes you have to, you somehow at some point in life get released from all of that and allow yourself to be who you are when you were young, when you had those aspirations to explore different things, as you were talking about. And if you have the courage to explore them, and you think about the world on this axis moving in this way and that way, the world is really your oyster in a way. The question is, how do you want to find the oyster?
Mm.
Okay, and that's the discovery that many successful people in life are going through. Those that sit and say, well, I got the CFO job here, maybe, I'll just look for a bigger CFO job. If that's what you want to do and that's your 30%, that's your Camelot, wonderful. Okay. But most people don't find that to be the Camelot. They find that it's just a job.
Mm.
It's just a job, but you're going to spend 60, 70 hours a week at it. So my guess is that you might want to have the courage to think about yourself.
Well, you've given us so much to think about. Gosh, I'm so glad you shared those final two stories. I'm going to say, not stop, but press pause, because you and I will keep talking, and I'll have you back, and we'll talk to an audience again and pick up the thread once more. Joel, thank you for making time, sharing your insight as always. You're so kind to do it. And everyone, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'm going to say have a great afternoon, wherever you are. All right.
My pleasure always, Tony. Hope
Thank
the
you.
audience enjoyed it.
All right.
And
Bye
we're
for
going
now.
to get some benefit from it.
Thank you. Bye.
Be well. Bye-bye now.
Tim.